Hi, I'm Craig. This is a series on Darwin's Voyage. And a voyage can be a metaphor for, say, an internal journey, like personal growth or intellectual shift. And both of those apply profoundly to Darwin during our story. But as a result of a literal voyage that he went on from 1831 to 1836, so 5 years, 3 months short of 5 years, during which time Darwin traveled all the way around the world, circumnavigated the globe. And during that time, he's observing geological formations, exotic plants, unidentified giant fossils, naked aborigines, lawless open country, an earthquake, multiple hikes through the Andes, the crater of a dormant volcano, coral reefs. And as you might expect, given what you know about Darwin, he also sees some thought-provoking animals. And looking back over his life, Darwin wrote, "The voyage of the Beagle," that's the name of the ship he was on, "the voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career." So in terms of personal growth, this is a paradigmatic story of leaves a boy, returns a man. He's 22 when he starts out on the voyage. Incidentally, a lot of the crew are teenagers. The captain is a ripe old 25. And in terms of intellectual transformation, intellectual evolution, I almost want to say, when Darwin returns from the voyage, age 27, his father reportedly exclaimed, "Why, the shape of his head is quite altered," which presumably has nothing to do with anything. But I like that image. Darwin, when he sets out on the voyage, was a creationist, mostly uncritically, just taking up the assumptions of the culture around him. But to the extent that he did hold it as a self-aware, explicit worldview by which he was judging what he was seeing, it was definitely not that the observed similarities among life forms pointed toward common evolutionary ancestry. His integrating principle wasn't similarity or continuity among life forms and their behavior. His integrating principle was the observed complexity of life and their behavior. Animals don't happen by accident, right? I mean, eyes, wings, systems, reproductive, cardiovascular, there's a lot of intricacy. Also, as an extension of this intricacy, the goodness of fit between life forms and their environment. Bee visits flower, elephant disperses seeds, beaver makes a dam, creates wetland, all which working together, the parts and the whole, seem to point toward the benevolence and obvious design of a creator. Of course, Darwin is eventually going to offer a different explanation for how things come to fit together so well. But prior to the voyage, and one of his main frameworks throughout, was that intellectual tradition known as natural theology, extremely mainstream at the time, celebrating the study of nature viewed as God's handiwork, the study of nature as a means through which one can know the attributes of God. And these ideas had been most popularly articulated by Reverend Paley in Darwin's day. And looking back on his mindset at the beginning of the voyage, Darwin later wrote, quote, "I do not think I hardly ever admired a book more than Paley's Natural Theology. I could almost formally have said it by heart." So we're going to go on Darwin's personal and intellectual voyages with him by going with him on his literal voyage. And starting out, at the time he's a nobody, and the voyage had nothing to do with Darwin. The voyage's official mission was, it had multiple goals, but primarily to chart the coast of South America. South American countries were recently independent, and so that just offered a potentially attractive trade opportunity for Britain. And Darwin, as I said, was 22. He had just graduated university. He didn't know what he wanted to do. He was actually going out for an additional year of divinity training. He was going to join the clergy. He's from a respectable family. He's expected to do something respectable. So that was the plan he had come to terms with. Medicine had been the typical calling in the family. Darwin's father was a doctor. His grandfather had been a doctor. His brother was, at the time, studying to become a doctor. But Darwin had dropped out of medical school after just 2 years. And this is the 1820s, so you can use your imagination what invasive surgery was like. And then the consolation career decided on for Darwin by his father was that he should become a clergyman, Reverend Darwin. Now, an extended sea voyage doesn't seem like it has a lot to do with becoming a clergyman. or being respectable. So unsurprisingly, Darwin's father was against it, the whole wild scheme. But eventually he was swayed by Darwin's uncle. Here's a quote from a letter. The undertaking would be useless as regards his profession, but looking upon him as a man of enlarged curiosity, it affords him such an opportunity of seeing men and things as happens to few. And for Darwin, that enlarged curiosity at the time was what was called natural history. When he was supposed to have been studying medicine and divinity, he had actually been joining clubs about biology and geology and hanging out with biologists and geologists. He had actually been becoming educated in spite of his education. And that's how his name came up as a potential candidate for the voyage in the first place. But Darwin and his father still assumed that Darwin would join the clergy when he returned. After all, he was just going as a supernumerary. That's someone with no official position. He had to pay his own way, which his father generously covered. And it wasn't anticipated that beyond seeing men and things as happens to few, the trip would necessarily amount to much for Darwin. It was also thought that the voyage would run closer to 2 years, not 5. And over the next few years of the voyage, indeed, Darwin proved himself to be a man of enlarged curiosity, an amazing observer, an eager collector, agile theorizer, and gradually he came to be viewed as the ship's naturalist, becoming a significant clearinghouse of specimens, fossils, mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, plants, rocks, did I say bugs? Slimy sea stuff, amassed by Darwin and shipped back to England with detailed notes and observations. And he didn't know this was happening. Some of his letters were being passed around and read. Eventually 10 of them were copied and bound together. So his name was becoming known within scientific circles for his writings and specimens before he'd even returned. Most important to his future, once he was back, he edited the journals and notes together that he had kept while on the voyage. And the resulting volume was published as Journal and Remarks, part of a multi-volume set of writings by multiple captains of the Beagle. And Darwin's portion received enough positive acclaim that it was very soon after, 3 months after, published as a separate volume. Journal of Researches into the Geology and Natural History of the various countries visited by the HMS Beagle, now known simply as Voyage of the Beagle, which became an unanticipated bestseller, making Darwin famous long before, 2 decades before, he would publish anything on evolution. This is how Darwin first made his name, and we're going to go with him on that, most of the time exploring South America. He does a lot of exploring of the interior. Quote, "There's high enjoyment at being able at any moment to pull up your horse and say, 'Here we'll pass the night.'" And he's on and off the ship, going up and down the east coast, Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina. This includes Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, and then up the west coast, Chile and Peru, including, as I said, several trips high into the Andes. And then, of course, the Galapagos Islands. Darwin calls this a little world within itself and very influential on his thinking. Then back home to England the long way, continuing around the globe, very brief stops, Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia, Mauritius, South Africa, and St. Helena.